Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are digging into something huge, the 2008 financial crisis. We're going to use the actual data, the real reports from back then, to piece together just how a booming economy could suddenly turn into a global meltdown. Let's get into it.
And that's really the core question, isn't it? How could something as wholesome as the American dream, owning your own home, somehow spiral into this absolute nightmare that nearly took down the entire global economy? It's a wild story. All right, here's how we're going to break it all down. First up, the perfect illusion. We'll look at the booming economy that really set the stage for everything that followed. So let's set the scene. We're in the early 2000s, and honestly, the US economy looked incredible. It was almost too good to be true. On the surface, it really felt like this golden era of prosperity that was never going to end. Everyone felt totally secure. So what was driving all this? Well, a huge piece of the puzzle was really low interest rates. The Federal Reserve made borrowing money super cheap, and that was like pouring gasoline on a fire. Credit was just everywhere. People were spending like crazy, Wall Street was making record profits, and it really truly felt like the party would go on forever.
Now, all that cheap money had to go somewhere, right? And a ton of it flooded into the housing market. Just look at this. Home prices literally doubled in just 6 years. That's insane. And this is where a critical mental shift happened. A house stopped being just a place to live. It became a golden ticket, a guaranteed can't-lose investment.
And that right there, that was the big lie. The single most dangerous illusion that the entire house of cards was built on. This idea, this belief that housing prices never fall, blinded everyone. We're talking bankers, homebuyers, even the people who were supposed to be watching the system. Nobody saw the gigantic risks that were quietly building up right under their feet. Okay, so with everyone convinced housing was a sure bet, let's look at what that did to lending, because it completely changed the game, and not in a good way. It was the perfect recipe for disaster. So the whole mindset of the banks just flipped. It used to be, okay, can this person actually afford to pay us back? A pretty sensible question, right? But that changed to, how fast can we sign the papers and flip this loan to someone on Wall Street? All the old rules, checking income, credit history, they just got tossed right out the window. And look at the result of that shift. By 2006, 1 out of every 5 mortgages in the country was what they call subprime. Now, that's just a fancy term for a super risky loan, given to people who were, let's be honest, very likely to have trouble paying it back. You can just see how the entire foundation of the housing market was getting shakier and shakier. I mean, it got so out of control, so reckless, that banks were literally giving out loans to people with, get this, no income, no job, and no assets. They actually had a name for them, ninja loans. It became a running joke on Wall Street that as long as you had a pulse, you could get a mortgage. It's crazy to even think about. All right, so we've got this giant pile of risky debt. What happens next? This is where Wall Street steps in and performs some, let's call it financial alchemy. They cooked up these incredibly complex ways to bundle all this risky stuff together and sell it to the world as pure gold. Okay, so stick with me here, because it gets a little complicated, but it's super important. The banks took thousands of these individual home loans, the good, the bad, the ugly, and mashed them all together into something called a mortgage-backed security, or MBS. Think of it like a big financial smoothie. They then sold slices of this smoothie to investors. This was great for the banks because they got their money back right away and could go make even more risky loans. But here's the kicker. Hidden inside these smoothies were all those toxic subprime mortgages. But they didn't stop there. No way. They took it to another level with something called a collateralized debt obligation, or a CDO. If an MBS was a smoothie, a CDO was like taking leftovers from a bunch of different smoothies and baking them into a new, even more complicated cake. The whole idea was to slice and dice the risk so many times that it looked like it just vanished. But it didn't vanish, it was just hidden. This wasn't about reducing risk, it was about hiding it. And this slide, this shows you the absolute heart of the deception. The official credit rating agencies, the watchdogs who are supposed to tell us what was safe, gave these things AAA ratings. That's the highest, safest rating you can get. They were basically saying this toxic sludge was as safe as a US government bond. And who was paying these rating agencies? The very banks that were creating the sludge. It's just unbelievable. They were selling financial poison and labeling it as a vitamin. Well, a party like that can't last forever. By 2006, the music stopped. The bubble had stretched as far as it could go, and then it popped. And that whole fragile system, that whole house of cards, it didn't just wobble. It started collapsing with terrifying speed. And just like that, the dominoes started to fall, one after another. It all kicked off when housing prices finally flatlined and then started to drop. All those people with risky loans suddenly found themselves underwater, and defaults just skyrocketed. That sent a shockwave through the whole financial system. Bear Stearns teetered and then collapsed. And then came the big one, September 15th, 2008. Lehman Brothers goes bankrupt. That was the moment the dam broke and the panic went completely global. After Lehman went down, it was pure, unadulterated panic. The credit markets just froze solid. Imagine the entire plumbing system of the global economy just freezing up overnight. Banks had no idea who was holding the bad debt, so they were terrified to lend to anyone, even each other. The flow of money, the very lifeblood of the economy, just stopped. Dead. So, while you have governments scrambling, trying to prevent a complete and total meltdown of the financial system, the real pain, the real cost, was being felt not on Wall Street, but on Main Street, by ordinary people all around the world. The government's first move was to pass this huge, and let me tell you, incredibly controversial bailout program called TARP. We're talking $700 billion. Now, the idea was to pump money into the banks to keep them from failing and dragging the whole economy down with them. But for millions of Americans watching at home, it looked like the government was just handing over a giant bag of money to the very people who caused the mess in the first place. And you can totally see why people were so angry, right? Because behind those massive bailout numbers were real shattered lives. We're talking millions of families losing their homes, 8.7 million jobs just gone, and so many small businesses, the lifeblood of so many communities, were just wiped out. This wasn't just numbers on a spreadsheet. The pain was real, it was personal, and it was deep. That beautiful dream of owning a home, the one that started this whole thing, it turned into a nightmare for so many. It left behind these empty ghost neighborhoods and emotional scars that, for many people, haven't healed to this day. So, after all that chaos, when the dust finally started to settle, the world basically said, okay, never again. And governments got to work creating a whole new set of rules to try and make sure a catastrophe like this could never, ever repeat itself. So what did they do? Well, they brought in major new regulations, like the Dodd-Frank Act here in the US. The goal was to put up guardrails, make banks hold more capital so they couldn't collapse so easily, and stop them from making wild, speculative bets. But for a lot of people, all this felt like closing the barn door after the horse had bolted. That lingering anger, that feeling that the system was still rigged, is what eventually boiled over into movements like Occupy Wall Street. And that's the big question we're left with, isn't it? The rules have changed, for sure. But has the fundamental risk really gone away? The financial system today is arguably even more complex than it was back then, and it makes you wonder, did we really fix the problem, or are we just living in the quiet before the next big one?